Hi everybody, and welcome to Growing Through. Really glad that you're here with us on this learning journey. In Growing Through, you're going to be introduced to some new concepts and also different ways of thinking about and talking about some of the things you might already be thinking and talking about, whether that's in relationship to psychological distress, to what we call the 5Ds, the 5Ps. I'm going to introduce you to a lot of new terms and also the core practices of growing through. And there's several of those. We have 5 of them. You'll treat those in other trainings, elements. But today I wanted to kind of just distill down for you what the essence of the growing through approach is, so you can kind of start from that basics. So one way to think about growing through is our focus specifically on encountering intensity, or as we sometimes call it, authentic, compassionate encounters. So authentic, compassionate encounters, or ACEs, you might want to say, you want to have an ACE today, is a way to kind of frame out what's happening when we meet with somebody in the spirit of service, in the spirit of support, and we bring our full selves to that encounter. Now this applies regardless of the situation, so to speak. So whether somebody is, just kind of calling you off the cuff, you're meeting somebody here or there for coffee and they're bringing up some things that are sensitive and hard to talk about, or somebody's reaching out to you in a time of really intense stress, or what we call even suicidal intensity, the principles of connecting and relating with somebody at those times all are the same. So we boil this down again to the ACEs. We're going to talk about authentic, compassionate, encounters. I want you to think about each of these words because each of them has a very specific meaning. Compassionate, I'm going to start with there because I think that we all recognize that the essence of connecting with somebody and enabling somebody to feel heard when they're having a hard time really is about compassion. Now, when we talk about compassion and growing through, we're actually talking not just about a feeling, but kind of a set of actions. Like, how do we act compassionately? What does compassion mean as a verb as opposed to as a noun? And one way to really think about this is compassion is the ability and the willingness to be present with another person's pain. Now, that isn't necessarily really easy, and actually it can be quite challenging. So we focus a lot in growing through on the authentic aspect. Authentic aspect means a couple of things. It means that we enter into these encounters understanding that we don't necessarily know what's going to happen from them, that we might not even feel like we ourselves are in the greatest place to have that encounter at that time. But we bring our whole selves to them through intention. Through intention, we say, okay, I'm going to be here in this moment. We recognize also that we are part of this moment. And we're going to accept what's happening with it and the direction that it goes. That doesn't mean that we don't have skills, that we're not going to sort of meet the situation with a kind of a special quality, or that we're going to not use the practices that we're going to develop. But it means that we set this intention from the very beginning. What that means and how that kind of comes about in your practice as a growth ally is something that we'll discuss further down the line. But focusing on intention is really important also because it reminds us of this other concept, which is core to our training, which is about the use of self. Use of self. Now, use of self sounds like either kind of maybe a really simple term that doesn't really mean anything, or some kind of complex, very strange, bizarre concept. But in a certain sense, it's not really anything different than what you're doing on an everyday basis. The big difference is mindful awareness of that. So use of self is the practice of understanding that when we're interacting with somebody, ourselves are being what we do and what we say and how we respond has an intentional quality. Every day, people are using themselves in all sorts of different ways. I'm using myself in a very specific way right now, as an example. You are also using yourself in all sorts of different ways. Most of the time, probably 90% of the time that we're awake, we don't really think about the fact that we're using ourselves or how we're using ourselves. But when we encounter somebody who's experiencing intensity and distress, and in particular if it's a highly intense moment, this aspect of being aware of ourselves is really significant. Now, so we intend use of self. We intend also a few other things. We intend to give care. What that means and how that shows up could vary. Could be very different on one day from another day. But we intend this giving care without necessarily knowing what it means. We also intend understanding. Now, intending understanding means that our goal is to help ourselves understand the situation that the other person is going through. That can be very different, and again, at any given different time. But it is important to recognize that when we intend understanding, we seek to grow in knowledge about what the other person is experiencing and how they're experiencing it. That doesn't mean that we're going to come into a comprehensive understanding of their situation. It doesn't mean that we could tell them what to do, or we might even know what's best for them. In fact, that's something we really want to suspend, is that sort of intention to fix. We're going to talk about that later when we talk about the practices of positive inhibition, etc. We also intend to share the journey. So in this case, when we intend to share somebody's journey, and in particular, if it's a hard journey or if they're at a hard point in their journey, that means kind of going back to the compassion place, that we're connecting and we're able to be with them, and we're willing to be with them in times of distress, including acknowledging pain and struggle that they might be going through, and to walk alongside them. Now, this is one of the things that on a certain level is kind of intuitive, but also makes the growing through approach a little bit different. So if you've done training in peer support, this concept might be a little more familiar. For others, it might seem awkward, and others might be very intuitive. But the point is, in our approach to supporting others, we're walking along with them. We're sharing this journey. It's not our journey. We're not leading. We may be following, at least in terms of as trying to gain understanding. But we're going to share that road with them. That's how we activate compassion here. And it brings us to the other kind of core practice. So this is sort of a meta practice that includes other things in growing through, but it's what we really think of as sort of the essence of the communication work in our growing through training series, which is compassionate curiosity. Compassionate curiosity allows us to connect to the heart of compassion, to this desire to understand people, to be intentional about how we're working with somebody and particularly listening to them, and to focus us on the desire to kind of come to a closer understanding of what they're going through, without presuming, without giving information, without giving advice, really importantly. So, from this point of view, we're using ourselves, we're bringing our compassionate heart, we're engaging this encounter intentionally. And to that matter, there's one other really core aspect that we want to think about, and it's a motto that I want you to consider. You don't have to agree with it right now, but I want you to consider as we go into this course. Connecting to our intentional use of self, and doing less. So, by doing less, we can be more present and therefore more authentically helpful. By doing less, we can be more present. When we're more present, we can be more authentically helpful. Why is this the case? Well, some of this connects to some of the other concepts that we're going to talk about related to the wise mind as a sort of intersecting point between the intellectual mind and the emotional body. And another part of it is really just about recognizing that sometimes our intentions, these sort of almost instinctive reactions we have to what's happening with somebody else, get in the way of us being really authentically with them. And they may even impel us to do things that are going to work against that relationship. So you'll hear us talk about the big R, the relationship. That's the key to supporting someone, the quality of that relationship, regardless of whether you've spent 10 years learning to do in-depth psychoanalysis, regardless of whether you've never done a single course in support or psychology before. The quality of the relationship that you have with somebody else is what makes a difference in terms of what they gain out of your work being with them. And again, so just to clarify, this applies again to any kind of intentionally supportive work related to somebody's emotional health or even just their kind of life situation. We want to always preserve the quality of that relationship. If we do less, we're able to hear more. We're able to kind of take in more and really be more present, as we've talked about, because we might be aware that maybe in this moment I want to have the desire to fix this, or I want to suggest something, or even internally, I don't want you to feel that bad. I want to stop you from feeling this bad. In our work here in Growing Through, as growth allies, sharing the journey, we use our compassionate curiosity to drive powerful communication, and we start off by doing less. So in our next sections, you're going to start to think about very specifically, how do we do less? How do we come into a deeper understanding? And how do we combine these with our use of self in an intentional way to be authentically present and genuinely helpful?